Before there was Apex Legends, the hit movement-based battle royale shooter that virtually came out of nowhere, Respawn had a series that laid the very groundwork for that title, as well as impressed fans to a next-level degree. Respawn would release Titanfall 1 and 2 within nearly 2 years of each other, and both would create rumbles in the internet that we still feel today. With Titanfall 1's launch in the March of 2014, Respawn put themselves on the map, letting everyone know that the team comprised largely of former Infinity Ward staff was going to mean business, and wasn't just going to be known for the successful COD franchise. Respawn would follow this up in October of 2016 with a sequel launch dubbed Titanfall 2, this time including a much adored single-player campaign, as well as making a number of new changes to the existing multiplayer of Titanfall 1. Although oftentimes shooters sort of quietly fade into obscurity in a way many virtual worlds just aren't afforded the luxury of, partly due to the design of them, and also partly due to the business model. Sometimes titles can also have extremely long lives way after their original shelf lives, such as Wolfenstein Enemy Territories or Counter-Strike. And well, other times those titles find themselves in this series, rather prematurely. This is the case with both Titanfall projects, with both of them having nearly non-functioning official multiplayers at this moment, and Respawn and EA seemingly having moved on. Why did both Titanfalls only years after their launch seem to have already started to find many issues in increasing or even just maintaining their player bases, now having nearly non-existent populations? And why did things get so awry that Respawn had to pull Titanfall 1 from the stores altogether? We will find out this and more on the Death of a Game series, a series where we take the largest contributing factors to a game or company's demise and catalog them over the course of a timeline, finding any clues and evidence along the way that can help us with our final deduction. Every detective's favorite point of the mystery, I should add, where we solve the case. If you miss out on any of the clues along the way, make sure you pay attention to the final deduction and any potential clues for the next episode at the end of this episode. The story of Respawn is very much the story of the ashes of Infinity Ward forming together and being rebirthed as a phoenix, or something like that. The reality was slightly less glamorous, with Infinity Ward co-founders Vince Zampella and Jason West being escorted out of the studio by security, accused of breach of contract and insubordination. They then would sue Bobby Kotick's Activision for $36 million, which would then be countersued, and the duo accused of trying to steal Infinity Ward, the studio, and then things would end up being settled eventually, out of court, but that was kind of the story of the birth of Respawn, which is a very fitting name, eh? Infinity Ward, of course, was responsible for the smash hit Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare just recently at the time, though the founders in question had left before creating the second game that they were also tasked with working on. Titanfall would sprout from the very beginnings of Respawn as a company. Producer Drew McCoy would state about the early goings of Titanfall that we had no idea what we wanted to do. We were a blank slate and it was really a long process to get here. We went through a lot of iterations on different things we wanted to try. We didn't really nail this down. We were making things in pieces that we are still using, but our pre-production prototype phase was really long. It came about over the course of a year or two. One of the strong hooks for Titanfall would be the movement and parkour system. This would take form from the company's programmers working on a rudimentary wall-running mechanic in the Source engine. The unlikely inspiration of Half-Life 2 would lead to the creation of Titanfall in many different ways, including them utilizing the very Source engine itself. The next strongest hook, which the name of the franchise would be named after, were the Titans in Titanfall. The Titans themselves were inspired by old-school modeling methods and constraints on resources. Made out of paper mache, or machetes as they were calling them, and being as large as 12 to 14 inches, these paper machetes were allowing the Titans themselves to take very real looks and be inspired by the Abrams tank itself. This helped also formulate the design of the gameplay and the very feeling of the world, with the big titans fighting against the small pilots by scale. It also helped Titanfall feel far more near future than something like Gundam, for example, that always felt more far future. Jason West, one of the key founders in both Infinity Ward and Respawn, would retire March 3rd, 2013. According to the reports, this would have nothing to do with Respawn or Titanfall, and was more so based on personal family issues, but him being a key figure means that I still needed to cover it. Respawn would come out swinging and announce Titanfall August 2013, trying to break free from their hefty Call of Duty shadow. By December 2013, Respawn consisted of an overwhelming amount of veteran developers, and developers that had a lot of experience with shooters, so Titanfall really was a no-brainer. By December 2013, the game was feature complete, and only needed the remaining polishing and bug fixing to push to gold status, and then a launch. More Titans would be revealed, such as the Atlas Titan, an agile flea-like craft, the Ogre Titan, which is equipped with heavy armor and is a lumbering beast, and then the Strider Titan was also introduced, which seemed like the fastest of the Titans, being similar to MechWarrior's Commando, with the addition of a dash jet. The Titans in Titanfall were taking classic paper, rock, scissor approaches, where some were going to be better against others, and so on and so forth. Make no mistake though, a proper focused Titan can make short work of multiple pilots, really selling the whole David versus Goliath, or Davids versus Goliath aspect that Respawn was wanting to push. Due to limited resources, Respawn was only really targeting a PC and Xbox launch for Titanfall 1, and they were enlisting in the help of a successful port developer, Bluepoint Games, to help with the console portion of the game. Now, this is a point that many people would also start to speculate, including of course with the gift of hindsight. Why and how things could have been potentially much different had they also had a PlayStation launch originally. More impressions would come out concerning Respawn's new multiplayer-focused shooters, such as the maps being able to feature both AI, players, and Titans, up to 50 at the same time. The AI would consist of grunts, stalkers, and specters. Grunts being mostly fodder, stalkers the same, and specters presenting an actual challenge. Although it would be nice if the lot were more challenging to help build the immersion even more, since both teams have teams of AI that actually go to war with each other. Regardless, it still helps build each map and the immersion. You really do feel like you are going to war, compared to games like Battlefield, which lacked AI for many moons. Titanfall 1's beta would take place sometime in February of 2014, and reach an impressive 2 million players in the process. Titanfall 1 would launch March 11, 2014, and would shake up the multiplayer shooter scene altogether. Launching on both PC and Xbox, Titanfall would score an impressive 86 out of 100 from 68 different critics. It looked like the Respawn team had respawned, and done it again. IGN was glowing in their review of the game, granting Titanfall 1 a 8.9 out of 10 and claiming that it represents a potent fusion of established and modern design ideas, creating a tense and rewarding balance of power and moment-to-moment unpredictability. MOBA-like minions mixed with the traditional on-foot deathmatch, jetpack-powered locomotion, and giant robot combat, each role playing its own part in the battle and coming with its own tactics and strategies, while the well-designed maps make the ideal weapons and loadout completely situational and dynamic. IGN's criticisms would actually mimic the late Total Biscuits in many ways, concerning the lack of modes the game would offer, customization features available at launch, and the fact that the single player was a glorified multiplayer mission set. USA Today would give Titanfall 1 a perfect score, stating that Titanfall pulls off a difficult feat in the oversaturated first-person shooter genre, delivering a video game that feels unique and as thrilling as those first times you picked up Call of Duty or Battlefield. For Xbox One owners, this is spring's must-own title. The main way of experiencing Titanfall 1 was the attrition mode, which teams would win by scoring the most attrition points, which you would gain from both killing AI and humans. There were also some side modes like Last Titan Standing, Pilot Hunter, and Hardpoint, which would play exactly like they sound, but that's sort of it. Attrition was going to be the main way to enjoy Titanfall. Compared to some other flagship shooter modes, I think it was kind of fairly lacking. The concept of AI on the map wasn't entirely novel, though still largely new at the time, and the AI in Titanfall 1 wasn't really much of a challenge. That's about the most negative thing that I could say about Titanfall 1, which brings my favorite aspect of gameplay into focus: the movement. Put mech suits into these movement-filled player hands, and well, there's another of my favorite things added to the fray. Where Titanfall really shines though, where other shooters often don't, is the level of detail and immersion brought to each map and battlefield. With AI fighting each other, and often having execution and fighting animations with each other, it makes things feel real and immersive, something that Battlefield was lacking for many years. And games like Squad don't even have at all. The first DLC, which was included in the purchasable Season Pass, would include 3 new maps. 2 more DLCs would also follow, adding 3 more maps each, completing the Season Pass. While 9 new maps the first year might seem quite impressive, these maps feel like they could have been just included in the game to start for, and maybe added some more variety for the game modes, as well as building familiarity from the very start of the game, creating people's favorite maps. Asking a price for them for an already bare-bones multiplayer shooter was a bit of a hard ask for many players, myself included. The final major update would hit Titanfall 1 October 2014, and introduce an all-new co-op mode dubbed Frontier Defense, as well as include the ranked mode play. As I always do on the series, I always take note on how long it takes for a competitive shooter to receive a ranked mode, as it does insane damage on the normal player base due to a lack of proper matchmaking. Titanfall, with its fast pace, high ceiling of combat, would take 6 months to receive a ranked mode. This is more than enough time to turn players off from playing the game, especially when the whole David versus Goliath aspect of the Titans versus the pilots can be doubly frustrating when you aren't good enough to overcome that immense hill. This is a bit of an elephant in the room that I've kind of been avoiding since I like movement in games and stuff like that, but while the elusive and fast-paced animation cancelable movement in Titanfall was a major selling point for many, as I've stated, myself included, it made the skill floor, which is what you start at, pretty high to start with. And then at the higher ends, the skill cap is also absurd, with some pilots being able to outsmart Titans themselves and some Titans being able to take on multiple Titans at the same time. This all probably sounds awesome for veteran players, and it probably should, but the problem is when you compare something like Titanfall to something like Halo, a comparable fast-paced shooter, the difference being that Halo 3 and Reach were far more casual friendly, and they offered far more in variety of play. Titanfall taking that much skill to play and master was awesome, but it was just going to simply limit how many people could realistically play the game, especially if they didn't add any casual modes. Remember, Halo 3 didn't just have matchmaking, it also had custom games, a forge system which allowed people to build custom game modes, and so on and so forth. But the new mode and ranked were just in time for a Steam launch in November of 2014, which would help pick the population up. Titanfall was a new shooter, however, and Respawn still very likely had time to evolve it into something more. They already had a good reputation and made a good first effort, so things were looking good for both the company and their first game. In a shocking turn of events though, only just a year after the launch of Titanfall 1, Respawn would be confirming a sequel was on the way. This could be seen as slightly controversial because the only shooter making yearly sequels was the COD franchise, and this was one that the Respawn team used to be a part of, though their structure seems very different compared to Titanfall's. Would Respawn have enough time to evolve Titanfall 2 into something more than just Titanfall 1 with some extra stuff, which was already a niche shooter? Or would it just end up being a slight upgrade that fans would enjoy but would do very little to actually attract new players? Titanfall 1 had reportedly reached around 7 million in total sales and 10 million in unique player IDs. This was incredibly impressive for a new shooter, especially one that I just described as being niche, though it was supported of course by a veteran team. But the thing about shooters is that what keeps people playing them is progression and new content that constantly comes out. Just being a cool, fun game like you used to have with like CS1 doesn't really work anymore. Titanfall didn't have progression nor new content seriously at launch, and it wouldn't develop the rank system and a progression system and introduce the new content until later into that year. For competitive shooters, eventually making it to the content they need to sustain players is far more difficult than the other way around, of course. Because, obviously, because you're also plugging holes that existed since the launch of the game. Games like CS1, even if it's ancient, launched, feature, and game complete. And games like Halo 2 and Halo 3 launched with rank systems. But even though Titanfall 1 by all accounts and purposes was a success, EA, the publisher supporting Respawn Entertainment, seemed kind of tepid about the response. EA was expecting that the sequel, however, would greatly eclipse the previous game's sales and reception. This time around, EA was expecting around 10 million in sales for Titanfall 2, meanwhile having projections for their other shooter, Battlefield 1, in the 14 to 16 million range. While experts and, well, anyone with a pulse were wondering why EA was launching Titanfall 2 so close to Battlefield 1 in the first place when they owned both of the games, well, Andrew Wilson, EA CEO, stated that it was because they catered to two different types of shooter players, which is hilarious, as if there's a gulf of shooters for players to choose from, so much so that they had to choose only based on the major differences between the two. But well, anyway, everyone else that I already stated was warning that this was not going to end well for Titanfall 2. Battlefield was easily 10 years older as a series, far more established, and had 6+ more titles in the franchise. You couldn't even call Titanfall a franchise yet, it only had one game. And while Titanfall was more unique in aspects of movement and how the Titans themselves functioned, the core of attrition is not really that different from Battlefield's conquest or domination modes. If anything, it offers less in many ways. There's enough in similarity that players could default to whichever is the most popular or just looks the best, which is kind of the opposite point that Andrew Wilson was making. Forecast down or not, and common wisdom or not, Titanfall 2 would push to launch regardless October 28th, 2016 on Xbox and PC again, but this time also joining the PS4 for the first time. Now, Titanfall 2, to me, is one of the most interesting games that I've ever witnessed. And no, not necessarily because of the game itself, though it is a good game, it's because it's seen largely as this upgrade for Titanfall as a franchise, including an all-new punch-packing campaign. But it's interesting because, well, like the previous game, it managed to still impress so many critics and players at the same time, and scoring an impressive 89 out of 100 from 60+ critics. IGN, who would score it only 0.1 better than before, which is kind of odd considering they gave it such glowing remarks because of the new star-studded campaign, but I digress, number rankings just suck in general. But IGN would call TF2, or Titanfall 2, a rare sequel that evolves on every part of the original concept, so consistently for the better. In the previous complaints about progression, variety, and single-player story were all seemingly solved. All things were really pointing towards another successful Titanfall project, and an even more successful one than the previous one. But then, the sales started coming out, and apparently, TF2, as I'm going to continue to call it despite all the TF2 fans, aka Team Fortress fans, probably getting mad at me, including it also being made in Source Engine. Anyway, sorry. Titanfall 2, or TF2, had tanked at launch, despite a multi-platform launch. This might just seem like Respawn maybe just failing to meet expectations, but it was worse than that. They had failed to perform better than their previous game. Reportedly, TF1 would sell multiple millions of copies more than TF2. So that begs a question. Why did TF2 perform worse, despite being hailed as the better, more longer-lasting title? Well, we already covered the fact that EA was pushing the game to launch at the same time as Battlefield, so that was part of it. But was there more to it than that? According to some, Respawn had control over the launch date, and according to others, EA knew that launching at this time would be problematic, but they were looking to acquire Respawn the easiest. So they devalued them, I guess? There's a couple of these hypotheses, but regardless of what the actual truth is, clearly choosing to launch nearly the same time as one of the pioneer titans in the shooter industry was catastrophic. I think it's clear to see that EA had high expectations for the Titanfall franchise. Before they even released TF2, they were already working on multiple themed mobile games. 2 that would end up being cancelled, and a Titanfall online game that would also end up being cancelled, sort of like the Halo Online / Counter-Strike online game for the Eastern markets. Another reason TF2 was unable to sell better than TF1 is that the game was not that much more of an upgrade past the campaign. I had a friend, for example, who made this known to me, saying he never played single campaign anyway, so when he saw that TF2 had this as their main upgrade, he didn't even purchase the new game. And that's not counting a lot of the people will probably argue as well in the comments backing this up that TF1 is actually some people's favorite game. Titanfall 2, unlike Titanfall 1, would scrap the idea of paid DLCs and release their updates as free updates or DLCs, which was a good idea, introducing new maps, a new Titan, the Monarch Titan, and finally the Frontier Shield mode, the cooperative mode we mentioned in the previous game that functioned kind of like a horde mode. Although releasing these as free updates was an improvement, Titanfall 2 would still take another solid year to get their proper content state steady, with its population only continuing to shrink, especially because Battlefield 1 ended up being such a smash hit. It almost felt like rushing out TF2 had created so many of these unforeseen issues, both in terms of the launch date and their inability to generate the hype for it. TF2 just didn't have much of a hype cycle, it got overshadowed so much by bigger competitors. What if TF2 had a proper hype cycle, and a few years to build that up into something? I think they could have actually capitalized on their success a lot more. Former Respawn founder Jason West would leave retirement and join Epic Games. Now, not much is really stated as to what he would be assisting Epic Games with, but this is probably another way for Epic Games to gobble up more talent and a potential future competitor. Respawn was acquired back in 2017 by EA for $151 million in cash following TF2's release. They were now an EA subsidiary company, but quietly, they had been working on yet another shooter. Apex Legends was launched seemingly out of nowhere, and Respawn claimed to have worked on it largely in secret, and not with EA hovering over their heads. And while I find that hard to believe, even though it's a cool story knowing EA, it's harder to believe because immediately following Apex Legends' smashing success, EA would take credit for it anyway. But yeah, as most people watching this video know, Apex Legends was a smash hit, and far eclipsed anything close to what Titanfall had been previously able to hit itself. It was the Titanfall of the Battle Royale genre in many ways too, minus the lovely Titans. The sigh. Move over though, Titanfall, because Apex Legends is my real friend, said Respawn. Zampella would indicate sometime in May of 2020 that there was nothing in development currently for the Titanfall franchise, though adding he would like to see it personally, sort of hinting that perhaps maybe things were out of his hands. Titanfall 1, which if you remember only had been previously playable on Origin, would launch out of nowhere on Steam June 2020, and it was met with a mostly negative reception upon its launch. TF1 was plagued with severe technical issues such as a static jump scare every now and then with the audio, DLC map pack issues, and the worst part, sometimes matchmaking issues that made the game completely unplayable. This was made doubly worse because the single player in TF1 was just a multiplayer game mode. Hackers were destroying the matchmaking, crashing game clients and even servers entirely. Some believed that they were belonging to a disenfranchised group of Titanfall fans, and others believed that it was just hackers doing it because of the vulnerabilities being available, period. Probably a bit of column 1 and column 2 though, let's be a bit honest. Things were so bad that players were accusing Respawn of launching abandonware on Steam. Things would only continue to worsen by the next year, with Titanfall 2 being targeted as well, though the first took the majority of the brunt of the hacking, being almost unplayable for basically years at this point. Respawn would finally announce that help was coming April 2021 in the form of a patch, but unfortunately, that help didn't really do much, with both games still, in a bizarre, never-before-seen way, being brought to their knees by hackers. Hackers were even joining Apex Legends and filling up those lobbies and referencing Titanfall hacks in the process, asking for changes. It was a total wacko world unfolding before all of our eyes, and where suddenly hackers blend in as both the good and the bad guys, and everyone else, me included, is just confused about what the heck Respawn and EA are even doing. Respawn would finally bring help, if you would like to call it that in some backwards way, in the form of just outright removing the ability to purchase the first game from stores March 1st, 2022. The issue being that the Xbox player base didn't have any of the aforementioned issues, so they just lost the ability to gain new players easily. While this might have been a moral decision, and a right one business-wise, it seemed very late, and completely tone-deaf to what had been ongoing for many years at this point. Respawn, in the most bizarre way possible, seemed to just want to wipe their hands clean of Titanfall altogether, especially with the mega success of Apex Legends. Or perhaps their hands were ultimately tied, as EA was ultimately in charge now. The Titanfall community would save the day as they would ride in on a chariot dispersing a launch platform mod dubbed nerdSlayer, allowing you to play on and even host your own servers in Titanfall 2. Sadly, that would mean that the only way to play Titanfall 1 was using the official channels. That still didn't really work. Well, unless you buy the deluxe edition on Xbox and an actual game disc in the process, though you will only find players playing attrition game modes these days. Just make sure you don't buy the Origin version because it doesn't work anymore. But nerdSlayer actually allows you to still play Titanfall 2 on PC without issue. In a surprising turn of events though, that one janitor left working on Titanfall at Respawn would flip a switch and the servers would come back online for Titanfall 2 sometime in 2023. PlayStation and Xbox populations would be the best, with PC lagging behind, especially now due to nerdSlayer having filled that gap for a while. Titanfall as a whole was in a better place than it was a few years prior, where it was almost unplayable. But with no future game in sight, it still very much was in a dark place, especially compared to where it could have very much been. And so the music begins to play in the background, and my voice likely starts to shatter to pieces. Both of these signify that our time on this case has come to an end, and we have gathered enough clues to put this case to rest. Why did Titanfall 1 and 2 fail so quickly, and ultimately find themselves on this series together? Well, if you missed any of the clues along the way, both of them were improperly handled. They were launched in quick succession. Lack of marketing and hype for the second game. Hacking attacks brought both of the games to their knees. Both games were kind of abandoned. Apex Legends. EA's expectations as usual, apparently. And niche gameplay. Titanfall is a truly tragic tale. I don't know if we have ever covered a more positively received, both by critics and players, multiplayer title yet that still faltered very quickly after it was launched and never quite had the legacy that many believed, myself included, that it could have had. The worst part about the story for me is that we still don't really know if we put more of the blame on Respawn's poor management and mistakes or EA pulling the strings behind the scenes. With the success of Apex Legends, it seems like Respawn is far more focused on that and anything not Titanfall moving forward. And it also shows that they certainly have some talent still, right? Even if you're salty about how Titanfall ended up. While it might be a hard pill to swallow for some Titanfall fans as well, I think that in some part it has to be based in part on maybe Respawn's inability to believe in it and Titanfall as a product. Now, whether Titanfall should have ever even had Titan-level expectations in the first place, though, is actually a real question to ask yourselves. Special and impressive game or not, that doesn't necessarily mean it should have had the largest audience, especially with how high the skill floor and ceiling were in both Titanfalls. Maybe they could have occupied a space more similar to like Rainbow Six. That's why sometimes it's better for games to not try to appeal to as many players as possible. Or at least not have the financial expectations to do so. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for a hint about the next case.
Hell, it's about time.